2 hours and 11 minutes of silence. Yeah, it sounds like something by John Cage. Who? Man, you gotta get out more. You never heard sonatas and interludes? For prepared piano. Never mind. Just get out more, okay? Yeah. August 12th, 1951. UN Commander Matt Ridgway is pissed off. The ceasefire negotiations are going nowhere, and he says it's all because the communists don't want them to go anywhere. They're stalling. They're making ridiculous demands. They're breaking the rules they all agreed on. This has to stop. President Harry Truman tells Ridgway, don't blow the talks. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the ceasefire talks in Kaesong hit a real road bump, the issue of whether or not to use the 38th parallel as the line of demarcation. The communists are for it, the UN against it. On the 11th, after yet another argument for the 38th parallel, North Korean Delegate Chief Neidell concludes with, I have nothing more to say. UN Delegate Chief Turner Joy responds, neither do we. They then sit in absolute silence for 2 hours and 11 minutes before Joy asks, would you like to say something? To which Nam replies, at present, I have nothing to say. However, when the meeting breaks up, he says he intends to continue talking about the 38th parallel today. UN Forces Commander Matt Ridgway reports to Washington that he sees no evidence whatsoever that the enemy is likely to change his position. More specifically, this is what he actually says in his report. The UN delegation now believes that now is the time to intensify efforts to influence world opinion by pointing out the arbitrary, intransigent, and unreasoning attitude of the communist delegation and their obvious desire to deadlock negotiations if the UN does not meet their original demand. The record to date is devoid of evidence of communist good faith and is recently replete with evidence of intention to force us either to yield on issue of 38th parallel or to break off the conference. Ridgway has a plan to try to break all the stonewalling. He wants to tell his delegates to tell the opposition that the UN flatly, formally, and finally refuses to consider the 38th parallel as demarcation line. They would either just shelve the truce line issue for the time being or discuss a line based on the front lines as they currently stand. If, however, they do not get a response to this within 72 hours, then the UN would consider the talks terminated and because of deliberate acts of the communists. He brings this to the Joint Chiefs of Staff for their approval, and he does not get it. On the 10th, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley tells Ridgway, your instructions require that you not break off meetings without previous instructions from Washington, which is true. But the JCS worry here is that Ridgway might get himself into a position where the communist side calls his bluffs and breaks off the talks. On the 11th then comes a cable, one which also has presidential approval. In view of the possibility of communication delays and of necessity for highest level consideration, you should not set in motion any action contrary to above directives without prior JCS authorization. Termination of discussions is of such governmental importance as not to be left to exigencies of clearances or communications by some deadline hour. See, if the talks do fail, the Joint Chiefs want the enemy to be clearly responsible. And I do mean clearly. It has to be enough that the world condemns the communist side, not just saying, well, they disagree with us, so it's their fault. No. They have to be clear that they have patiently and persistently tried to obtain terms that would appeal to the entire world as fair and reasonable. The 38th parallel issue is partly of their own making, as they are aware. Secretary of State Dean Acheson and UN Secretary General Trygve Lie both made statements this spring, as we've seen, that implied the UN would accept the 38th parallel as demarcation line. So it makes sense to an extent that they'd latch on to that. So maybe Ridgway just needs to be patient and give the opposition time to adjust. Joint Chiefs tell Ridgway this: there is reason to believe that communists expected us to agree on the 38th parallel. It will take time for Moscow and Peking to amend their position. We cannot yet assume the difference between your proposals and 38th parallel is breaking point for communists. UN position on rejection of 38th parallel remains entirely firm, and you should anticipate no change in your instruction on that point. There's another issue that's creeping in, though. The communists have been accusing the UN forces of violating the neutral zone around Panmunjom. They first did this a few weeks ago, claiming that UN troops had fired guns toward it and that UN planes had strafed a truck of theirs. These were fairly minor, but now it's reversed. A whole company of armed Chinese troops marches right through the truce area at the end of last week on the 4th, within 300 or so meters from the UN delegation's house. This may be in response to the massive air attack last week, but whether it is or not, you can imagine how happy this makes Joy. He protests vigorously to Neidell that no troops, except MPs, are allowed within half a mile. Ridgway orders Joy to break off the talks that day. They remain broken off for 5 days, and he actually has a phone conference with Washington over this and says he wants either an explanation and an apology from the communists or an end to the talks. He even goes so far as to say that the language of diplomacy is pointless against the other side, and trying to be diplomatic degrades their own dignity. Okay, he says more than that. He says a lot this week. Okay, here are his actual words. The discussions are between soldiers. Half of them are communists who understand only what they want to understand, who consider courtesy as concession and concession as weakness, who are uninhibited in repudiating their own solemn obligations, who view such obligations solely as a means for attaining their ends, who attain to power through murderous conspiracy, and who remain in power by that and other equally infamous practices. To sit down with these men and deal with them as representatives of an enlightened and civilized people is to deride one's own dignity and to invite the disaster their treachery will inevitably bring upon us. Man, I think somehow they're starting to get under Ridgway's skin. President Harry Truman does not want to blow the talks, though. He firmly believes the Chinese are tired of the whole Korea adventure, and they really do want to get out of it. Ridgway is told to demand an explanation for the troops in the zone, sure, but agree to resume talks once they get one, and the other side consents to follow the agreed-upon rules. The Chinese do sort of apologize for their mistake, which was minor, and they say it was inadvertent. Ridgway is not satisfied with this and asks Washington if he can refuse to continue until he gets firm guarantees this won't happen again, or if that doesn't happen, a new location for the talks where the UN forces can guarantee themselves that this sort of thing won't happen. Washington does not bite. They say that demanding a bunch of new conditions now would be tough to justify to an awful lot of people. Ridgway should send his negotiators back to do their task, but warn against further violations. They do go back, but before that, there's another incident. On the 8th, the communists report the UN forces committed 2 violations the day before. UN planes assaulted a supply truck that flew a white flag, and also UN troops closed in on the bridge at Panmunjom, and some of them had fired at unarmed communist personnel. Again, but without much success, the UNC liaison officers patiently tried to convince their opposites that prior notification of convoy movements was the only guarantee of immunity. The communists insisted that the white markings were sufficient. Joy investigates this and finds that no UNC units had actually been in the Panmunjom area at the time this incident supposedly happened. There was also apparently a delay of 28 hours between the event and the claim being made. So Joy very much questions its validity. Both sides have been beefing up their defenses as the negotiations proceed. And on the 8th Army side, it is the Kansas-Wyoming line that is getting the works. Can we show that on a map? 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet has been particularly interested in fortifying Line Kansas in depth. Kansas does, yes, allow the enemy to still control the communications complex of the Iron Triangle, but it does actually give good defensive terrain, which isn't always the case near the 38th parallel, and it has a good road and rail network for easy logistical support. So he's been working on building that up, and also the approaches to it along the Wyoming line to blunt and delay any enemy attacks before they reach Kansas. He's also evacuated any and all Korean civilians from the area to prevent any enemy agents from posing as peasants for intel or sabotage. Even a month ago, the fortifications of Kansas were basically complete. Van Fleet has also, per Ridgway's request, submitted an offensive plan. Well, okay, he did last month. I believe I briefly mentioned it. It's called Plan Overwhelming and is designed to move 8th Army up to the Pyongyang-Wonsan line starting around September 1st if a few preconditions are met. Either an enemy withdrawal to the north or a big enemy deterioration, if 8th Army gets some big replacements, or if 8th Army's mission is simply changed. Ridgway's requirement that all major ground operations get Joint Chiefs approval was lifted July 10th, so he can do this if he chooses. He's watching the talks before deciding anything. Van Fleet was actually planning some limited attacks, but Kaesong being chosen as the site of the talks eliminates one of the places he planned to raid. Still, at the end of July, he issued his first attack order since early June. Since the enemy obviously has used the lull to build up, Van Fleet wants to probe enemy defenses, figure out how they're deployed, and keep them off balance enough that they can't start an offensive of their own. In addition, Van Fleet was aware that the combat efficiency of the 8th Army had slipped during the latter part of July. Patrols were conducted indifferently and failed to bring in prisoners. Gathering intelligence became an increasingly difficult task. Inactivity and the hope that the armistice talks would prove successful were a tough combination to defeat. As Van Fleet pointed out later, a sit-down army is subject to collapse at the first sign of an enemy effort. There are also small bits of territory he'd like to take which would improve their own positions, or at least remove threats to them. And one of the latter is in 10th Corps sector in the Taebaek Mountains. There is a circular valley there that the UN troops call the Punch Bowl. And the KPA, that's the North Koreans, holds the heights west, north, and east of it. And they can not only observe the UN defenses from there, they can direct artillery fire down on the UN lines. Taking the heights would reduce the effect of attacks in the region, which might split 10th Corps from ROK, South Korean 1st Corps, to the east, okay? In late July, US 2nd Division got a foothold on the western edge of the Punch Bowl, though rains have prevented any activity since then. Last week on the 4th, and now on the 8th, come diversionary raids in US 1st Corps sector, and the actual campaign is set to begin just a few days from now. But here, I will end this week of the war, with the talks sputtering along ever more slowly, Ridgway trying to get them to achieve something concrete, and both sides building up their forces since the active war is not over just because they're sitting down and talking about a ceasefire. It looks like there'll be some action in the field again soon, very soon even. But what exactly have they been building up all that force for? T.R. Fehrenbach writes in This Kind of War, the UN command no longer looked for victory in the field. It had already been committed to settlement in the vicinity of the 38th parallel, though it insisted on the present line of contact, not that indefensible imaginary line of demarcation on the ground. If it flailed ahead now, made great gains, these would have already been compromised and might well be lost at the conference table. Ridgway and Van Fleet and Washington were loath to spend lives for nothing, yet Ridgway and Van Fleet dared not sit still, letting their forces stagnate despite Washington. As summer ripened, there was no progress at the table. The communist delegations seemed willing, even eager, to delay forever. They had transferred the war largely to the truce table, and now they were as happily waging it as before, while they put the time they had bought to good use, if another round at arms should come. As summer deepened, and the hopes of the world slowly withered, another round at arms was bound to come. In the green and muddy hills of Korea, the war had not ended. It had begun a new and terrible phase. And as summer turns to fall, and fall turns to winter, I will still be here, assuming this war continues, bringing you this coverage. I can do that thanks to the Time Ghost Army. This channel's Time Ghost Army member of the week is Dwayne Cleghorn, and these are the newest commissioned officers. You too can join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com and be part of making history. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.